politics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to the Politics Guys, presents the U.S. Constitution. The Main Politics Guys is a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. What we're now also bringing you are in-depth series on topics in American politics and policies. Our Politics Guys Presents series will dive deeply, 1 week at a time, into a particular element of U.S. politics. In the Politics Guys Presents the U.S. Constitution, I, Dr. Trey Orndorff, and my co-host, Dr. Ken Katkin, will be diving into the U.S. Constitution, article by article, clause by clause. This multi-year project was originally only for supporters, but is now generally available to you, the listening public. If you like these shows, remember that the Politics Guys are presenting other topics right now to supporters. So head down to the show notes to get access to all of the Politics Guys and now all of the Politics Guys Presents series. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy yourself as you join me and Ken Katkin on our journey through the U.S. Constitution. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun kind of slowly but surely making our way through the Constitution, one little piece at a time. And today is no different. But what will make today maybe a little bit different is we're going to be finally finishing up our journey through the first article of the Constitution, where we have dealt with, primarily Congress and the legislative branch, which is what Article 1 deals with. But today we come to the very final section in Article 1. And the last section is, in fact, Section 10, which is all about the powers that are denied to states. And so, we've already gone through Section 9, and there's kind of a reciprocal relationship between sections 9 and 10, because as you might recall, last time we were in the show, we were going through the powers denied to Congress. And here we're going to see an implied what states can't do, oftentimes in relationship to what Congress can do. And so that's what we will start with first here when we come back in just a moment. Okay, so Ken, as I was saying, we're going to be doing Article 1, Section 10, and I figured what we might just do here is I'm just going to read the three clauses that come into this, because there's actually some larger elements, not always contemporaneously, but that are important when you're trying to kind of understand the history and the trajectory of the American Constitution. So I'm just going to go through here, starting with the first clause in Article 1, Section 10. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque or reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties or imports or exports, except what may be absolutely necessary for executing its expection laws. And the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by any state on imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject revision and control of Congress. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state, or with a foreign power, or engage in war, unless actually invaded, or in such imminent danger as will not admit delay. So I know there in that first clause, we have a couple of things going on, but there's a couple of really important bits to it, especially at the end. Now, of course, you get these kind of interesting things where, Congress has the ability to coin money, but not states, dealing with bills of credits. But we have, the law impairing the obligation of contracts, or as I understand it, weren't you dubbed something, Ken? I don't know. Don't you? You brought it up in Section 9 that you're like Kentucky Colonel Fried Chicken or something. What was?
I am a Kentucky Colonel. Article 1, Section 10 does say that the states cannot grant titles of nobility. So I'm gonna have to ask none of our listeners to go to court and try to get a declaratory judgment that it's unconstitutional for me to have that great title of nobility, Kentucky Colonel.
Well,
Which I
that's
do
kind of reminds me, I don't know, well, I'm sure Mike had to do it when he was sworn in as the faculty senate regent, I'm sure. But I remember as a student in NKU, there's all these things that you had to agree to that you weren't doing. One is that you didn't have a title, but the one that we always found funnier was that you were not a second or a participant to a duel. That doesn't fall into the here, but I like that portion too.
Well, I do consider Kentucky Colonel to be the highest and most noble title that anyone in the United States is capable of getting. So I like to keep that title. But if we're going to talk more systematically about Article 1, Section 10, you read it. The first three words, "no state shall," I'd like to just start by thinking about those a minute because the states have been mentioned a little bit earlier in Article 1. They come up in Section 2 and Section 3 as the units that we elect members to the House of Representatives from districts that are in states, and the states generally run the elections. And then the U.S. Senate, also the senators come from states, although Article 1 doesn't yet have the elections. That doesn't come till the 17th Amendment. So we've heard about states essentially as places that Congress members get elected, but we really haven't heard anything else about states until we get to Article 1, Section 10. And the Constitution, most of the main thrusts of it are just entirely about the United States government, and the states are sort of out there, but the states are they're recognized in this Constitution. But I think most parts of this Constitution sort of assume that states are run by their own state constitutions, and that this is a constitution for the United States government, for the federal government. So in that sense, Article 1, Section 10 is a little bit unusual.
Right. Well, just me, I think one thing, if listeners haven't thought about this is what Marshall called dual citizenship in Barron v. Baltimore, right? There you have two different relationships, one defined by states to individuals, and this is the one we're going through, the federal Constitution, which defines individuals' relationships to the federal government primarily.
Yeah, and so I think sort of and sort of a general theory of dual federalism would say, well, both of the governments, the state government and the United States government, they're both Republican forms of government. They're both governments of the people, by the people, and for the people. The Kentucky Constitution is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people of Kentucky. The United States Constitution is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people of the United States. And so we mostly expect the separate governments to get both their powers and the limits on their power from their own constitution. But here we are seeing a big exception to that. The United States Constitution is imposing limits on state governments. So it's not that the people of a state have decided, it's not that the people of Kentucky have decided not to let the Kentucky government grant me that title of nobility. It's that limit is coming from the United States Constitution. So this is actually the first thing we're seeing anywhere in the Constitution where the U.S. Constitution is telling the states, if you're part of the United States, here's something you can't do, even if you want to do it, and even if your own Constitution would allow you to do it. So then we can. I just wanted to say that. I didn't know if you had any.
No, you're right. As a matter of fact, that's the first phrase that's the first three words in each clause, right? State shall, no state shall, no state shall. And although it comes later, it's not part of the original Constitution. We'll see that kind of set up again when we get to the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, where you have the inverse of that: Congress shall not, Congress shall not, Congress shall not.
Right. We don't see the phrase "no state shall" again until we get the 14th Amendment after the Civil War.
Exactly.
Yeah. But right now, so we're seeing this. So there's things the states can't do. One thing about Article 1, Section 10 also, you can tell this was not written by modern lawyers because it's really, really poorly organized. And it seems like there's sort of two categories of things in here. There's some of these things are bad things that government shouldn't do. And so they also
ex post facto laws, for example.
Yeah. So you see those same prohibitions in Article 1, Section 9. So Congress isn't allowed to make ex post facto laws, and states also aren't allowed to make ex post facto laws. No government should make an ex post facto law. It's a bad thing. there's other provisions in Article 1, Section 10 that are, more in the nature of federalism provisions that states shouldn't be doing them because Congress should be doing them.
Like money, for example.
Like money,
that's
for
the big
example.
one. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is not that there's anything bad about having money in this country, but we want to have a United States currency, and we don't want states to have their own currency. And so states are prohibited from doing that. And so if I was organizing Article 1, Section 10, and I had 3 clauses, I probably would have only had 2 clauses. I would have had the list of bad things that, states can't do and Congress also can't do as one list. And then, the list of things that, are good for Congress to do, but just states shouldn't do them, as the other list. But that's not at all the way it's organized. So it just kind of randomly goes back and forth between those 2 categories. So we have to kind of, tease that out as we go through, I guess. Oh, yeah. So, I'm not trying to monopolize.
No, it's all good. It's all good.
Yeah. So if we start then with as you did with the treaties, alliances, and confederations, that's one of the federalism provisions, right? That the United States government, of course, does have the power to make treaties with foreign countries, even to make military alliances like NATO with foreign countries. But the states can't do that. They can't enter into treaties. They can't enter into alliances. They can't even enter into confederations, and that might be with one another, right?
Yeah.
So something like the Confederate States of America is expressly prohibited here, right?
And I think it might be worth, understanding contextually why this might come first. You might think, well, why are these treaties and alliances? Well, you got to recall back under the Articles of Confederation, one of the problems in the immediate aftermath of the end of hostilities between the burgeoning United States and England was, well, are we going to have a singular treaty system that's going to deal with them? Are we going to have one representative at that juncture? It's John Adams who's in England at that juncture. Or can individual states make their own bargaining relationship, right? Can they have their own individual treaties? And the problem with that, of course, was that gave a potential advantage to foreign parties to say, well, look, Massachusetts gave us this deal, so we're not going to take anything less than what we got from Massachusetts. So, from our point of view, it might be weird that this treaty is the first thing that no state shall. But in the immediate aftermath of some of what was viewed as the flaws of the Articles of Confederation and what just happened pragmatically post the hostilities of the Revolutionary War, it makes a lot of sense this comes first.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that some of the British colonies, Ontario, had not joined the United States, and now there was Canada out there, and there was the possibility that Britain might try to peel off some of them and all that. So there was so that's there.
I think I'm going to need to pause you right there, Ken, so that we can take a brief pause, and then you can come back and we'll take up with the next sets of clauses. Okay, so Ken, we ended the last section chatting about the states and treaties and no states. Continue the conversation there.
Yeah, well, as part of the very poor organization of Article 1, Section 10, the next clause prohibits states from granting letters of marque and reprisal, which is really one of the limitations on state military powers. But just for some odd reason, that's not grouped with the other limitations on state military powers. It's just kind of sitting there on its own. But Congress does have the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal. So this is one of those ones where, as with the treaties, states can't do it, but Congress can. So it's not an inherently bad thing. It's just a thing that has to be done by the national government. And the letters of marque and reprisal, that's a phrase you don't commonly hear these days. But what that was just putting bounties on the heads of foreigners. And it was mostly used against international criminals like pirates and people like that. So if pirates weren't a country and we couldn't declare war. It was the early version of the war on terrorism. Right?
Yeah, I was thinking
early version of the war on terrorism.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. So the letters of marque and reprisal would be a way that Congress could use military force or pay bounties for privateers or mercenaries to fight against what was the 18th century version of international terrorism, short of declaring war against a foreign country. So Congress can do that. States cannot do that, and that's just one of the several clauses that prevent states from generally exercising any kind of military powers that the United States can exercise.
And as you're talking about, the weirdness of the list, so, as you get to this kind of second bold item, what follows immediately when you get with coining money, emitting bills of credit, those are actually specifically things Congress, we saw in Article 1, Section 8, gets the power to do. It's kind of okay, not only does Congress have this power, but these are things we don't want the state governments to have power.
Yeah, but that list like jags back and forth that way because the first.
But then we get to bills of attainder, which is a no for both. Yeah,
no for both, and then back to impair the obligations of contracts, which is something Congress can do, and then back to titles of nobility, which neither of them can do. So it really just jags back and forth in a random way, I think. Yeah, so coining money, emitting bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender. Even that, I think, jags back and forth a little bit. It's very clear that Congress can coin money and emit bill of credits, but states can't. So
yes.
we can only have United States currency in this country. Now, the making anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, some people have read that to be similar to the Congress having the power to coin money. So there were some debates about that in the 19th century, whether the power to coin money prohibited U.S. currency going off some kind of gold standard, whether we could have paper money, but they used to argue, does the paper money have to be backed by coin? If they were printing money and it wasn't backed by coin, would that go beyond Congress's power to coin money?
Right.
So we're told that states can't coin money, and it turns out that Congress, in the end, in the gold clause cases, it does end up getting the right to go off the gold standard. So by now, this was a little uncertain, until the late 19th century. Congress can make a U.S. currency. It doesn't have to be backed by coin or gold or silver, but states can't have any currency, and that's kind of really the contemporary interpretations of that.
So, we really have already talked about bills of attainder and ex post facto laws. Because again, as you've noted, we're zagging back again for the things that we're just saying governments can't be allowed to do. But then we get the impairing or law impairing the obligation of contracts. And for a long time in American history, that's actually a really important aspect of jurisprudence. So this goes back to thinking about, well, what would could states interfere kind of with private property rights is what a lot of it ends up having to be figured out. Take us through that a little bit.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And although that what you said is right, but that might have come a little bit, a decade or two after the ratification of the clause. So that when Hamilton argued for this clause and getting it put into the Constitution, he argued for it in the Federalist Papers. Hamilton's big idea was that we need both a stable currency and a stable banking system. That if we're ever going to have conditions where businesses can be stable and can grow, capital can be harnessed and reinvested, and we can achieve material prosperity. Hamilton argued that it starts with not being too quick to allow debt relief. So his idea was you need a stable banking system, but a stable banking system needs to have some assurances that when it loans money, the debts won't be forgiven. It'll be paid back. But yet it was also seen at the time there's got to be some legal mechanism to deal with bankruptcy, because it does happen that people owe debts and can't pay, and there needs to be some kind of legal process for working that out. So we can't have a legal system that never can discharge debts, or else we'll just have chaos when people can't pay their debts. But we can't have a legal system where it's too easy to discharge debts, because it'll often be popular. We're certainly seeing an example of that right now with the student loan debt forgiveness and all that. Yeah.
And in some instances, we'll see states, they kind of almost made that by percentage wise blush.
Yeah, and the PPP loans that were mostly forgiven, and
right.
There's always political reasons it's popular to forgive debt, and so the compromise that Hamilton argued for was bankruptcy law should be an exclusive congressional power. Congress should have the power to enact a uniform law of bankruptcy, within bankruptcy proceedings under law that Congress can enact, there will be ways to do orderly workouts of bankruptcies and debts. But states should not have the power to relieve debt, because state debt relief would be something that would really threaten the stability of a financial system. Because, maybe in New York State, where you've got Wall Street, the banks would have enough influence that they could fight that back. But in every other state, the debtors are always going to have more political sway than the creditors, and so they're going to get debt relief laws, and it'll dry up the availability of capital. So that sort of was the Hamiltonian argument for putting giving Congress an enumerated power to make a uniform law of bankruptcy, but taking away from the states the ability to impair the obligation of contract, which he mainly saw as to impair debts.
Right. But now this kind of takes on a different mode as we get into Chief Justice Marshall's interpretation of it. But
absolutely,
before we get to Marshall's conception of that, we're going to have to pause for a minute and just say that this is where we end the preview. So, Ken, what happens here is that Marshall. So, this is something that I think is worth. We've said this a bunch of times, right? So the Constitution gets written, but then you get it put into practice in a variety of different ways. And of course, Chief Justice John Marshall ends up kind of putting a stamp on the court. I mean, in some areas for a long time, or in other areas, even till the contemporaneous period. And Marshall had some really strong views on private property, economic development, and the role of the federal government. And specifically, he had a particularly elevated status of the contract clause, because he viewed the contract clause as kind of essential to the right to private property to not be destroyed by states. And he thought that, as you were kind of noting, the only place where this could even potentially occur would have been with Congress. And so for Marshall's 3 decades on the court, the contract clause is going to have a really elevated status. So take up where you starting there from Hamilton. What happens with Marshall now?
Yeah, and I think, maybe even more than just a few decades. This is through most of the 19th century.
I just meant his 3 decades is how he did it specifically. But no, it doesn't go away immediately. I'm sorry.
It doesn't really recede until the 1930s and the New Deal court. But so one of the first and one of my favorite early cases that sort of starts this shift is the Dartmouth College case. And maybe it was Daniel Webster, who was the lawyer for Dartmouth College, whose advocacy helped sort of push Marshall in the direction that you were talking about. And so Dartmouth College, then as now, it's an old college in New Hampshire. It's an Ivy League college. It's a private college. And it was set up long before the United States was set up. So it dates back to the royal colony of New Hampshire, and the king gave the college its charter and chartered it as a private college. And when the king chartered Dartmouth College in the 1600s, in the charter it said that they can be a self-governing private college, that they're not a public university. They're not going to be governed by the legislature of the state. And so they had that charter. They've been operating for a long time. The Revolutionary War happens. The United States gets started. New Hampshire's not a royal colony anymore. It's a state. And, again, and this sort of has some contemporary echoes, the kind of political interferences we're seeing today sometimes with what gets taught in colleges. The legislature of New Hampshire, which at that time still did not have any public universities at all. So Dartmouth was there, and it was a kind of distinguished private university. That there was no University of New Hampshire or anything like that. They decided, they changed the law, and they said, well, we want to have more say in what happens at Dartmouth College. And so, although the college had always in the past elected all of its own regents, all of its own board of trustees, the state changed the law and says from now on, the governor gets to appoint a bunch of the regents. And the college could still elect some of the regents. In fact, I think it was only a minority that the governor wanted to appoint, but it was all but one, or, the college would appoint, half plus one, and the governor would appoint everybody else. So that was the law that gets challenged in the Dartmouth College case. So it's not really about collection of a financial debt. It's not about debt relief. It's just about the question of, if the charter that the king gave this college, which can be seen as a contract, right? That the king said to the college, if you put the resources into opening up this college and running it, I'll promise you independence. Whether that contract is impaired if a later legislature and from a successor government. I mean, this is now not even the king anymore. It's the state of New Hampshire, which is now a state of the United States. If they want to change the deal and say, well, after the private college has done all this, after they've put resources into it, they've built it up, they've operated, they've made it a successful college. Now the state doesn't want to honor that promise that they can be independent and self-governing. Now the state wants to play a big role in their governance. Should that be seen as an impairment of the obligation of contract, with the charter being seen as a contract? And so Daniel Webster, who was the most famous lawyer in the country at the time, and also an alumnus of Dartmouth College, he argued this case to the Supreme Court. And they always say, there's no TV, there's no cameras back then, so we don't know. But they always say that,
well, there's still no cameras in the Supreme Court. Right? I mean, we get, you can listen to the audio of it.
But it's a very dramatic scene as described, where he makes his kind of technical legal arguments about why this kind of charter would count as a contract under the contracts clause, and why the change in governance rules would count as a impairment of the obligation of contracts. And he kind of closes his argument by dramatically pausing for a long time, as it's been reported, and putting both his hands on his heart and looking very doleful with his face, and saying, it's a small college, but there are those of us who love it, and supposedly bringing the justices all to tears, and he does win a unanimous judgment in the case. And so that's really the first major case that establishes this principle that if the government makes certain kinds of promises or certain kinds of representations like that to citizens, it can't just back out of them later, that could be seen as an impairment of the obligation of contracts. And that does do exactly what you were talking about. It gives a kind of stronger protection for property rights of various sorts than we would have had without that kind of doctrine.
Well, now another important one when it comes to the contract clause is Fletcher versus Peck, right? Where in this case, you have an issue where you actually have beneficiaries who have used fraud.
Yes.
So you have the Yazoo Riverland fraud, and so the beneficiary. So the state's like, wait a second, you can't do this. You've engaged fraudulently, and Marshall says, listen, I'm sorry, even if it's contrary to the public good, you can't impair obligations to contract. In this case, Georgia, you're in violation of Article 1, Section 10. Even if what you are getting at is in the case of the public good. And Fletcher's important, not just because of its contract clause, but I believe it's going to be one of the first where the court nullifies as state grounds on the contract clause grounds, which it will use for a while as a place to strike down state law.
Yeah, well, that also happened in Dartmouth College, as I described, because they struck down the state law that let the governor appoint some trustees. But yeah, and you didn't even really explain to the listeners the facts of the Yazoo.
Well, that's true. Well, take us through the facts, because they're crazy.
They're crazy. Yeah. So, and they're terrible. So this has to do with the Cherokee Trail of Tears, right? So the Cherokees are living in western North Carolina and in Georgia, and that's where their land is. And as you well know, because you're out in Oklahoma.
Guess where they came?
Yeah, they got run
came is the wrong. I apologize. That is not the right word. Where they were forced,
where they were driven to. Yeah. So the Cherokees were not really in Oklahoma. They were in Georgia and North Carolina, and those states passed laws that just simply confiscated all their land and kicked them out. And they had to walk the whole way out to Oklahoma, to a much more difficult place to live, and they had to walk. How far is that? Like more than 1,000 miles, I take it.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, if anybody is interested, the actual trail itself and the path, you can be at different points on it. My family and I, we have actually traveled the entire length of that, because now back in North Carolina, there is again the Cherokee Nation, because they were able to get some of that a tiny
Right.
portion of that back. So you can actually go from the Cherokee Nation in the top part of North Carolina and the Appalachians all the way here. It actually takes you through Memphis and Fort Smith to the kind of the edge here of Oklahoma.
Yeah, and you didn't have to walk it when you did it with your family, but
We've actually walked a piece of it, and it's. I mean, trust me, nobody today would be able to kind of do it. If you want, the closest you can do, if you really want to kind of get some of that, is the longest east-west trail in the United States actually begins not deep into Oklahoma and traverses all the way across for 800 and some miles. That's the longest east-west hiking trail in the United States. And it's not, you've got to go almost double that to be going the length of the Trail of Tears.
Yeah. So the next chapter of the story here is.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, continue.
That's great. Yeah. So I was very delighted to hear all that. So and interested. So after the Georgia legislature succeeds in clearing the Cherokees from their land, then the next step is, well, what are we going to do with the land now? And so the Georgia legislators, they said, well, we've got, campaign contributors and we've got these Harlan Crow types who are our friends. Let's just give them the land. So that's what they did. So they passed a law, and they, having used all the resources of the state, very unjustly to kick the natives off, they didn't even, have any fair system of distributing it to the people of Georgia. They just simply gave it to corrupt cronies of the legislators, and they passed laws that gave it away that way. Now that's what was called the Yazoo land grant scandal, and the scandal at the time was seen as not the fact that they kicked off the Cherokees. That wasn't the scandal.
No, nobody cared about that. It was what you did with it afterwards, just to be clear. Right. I mean, anyway. I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. That's what the scandal was, that a lot of ordinary Georgians thought they were going to get on that land. And
ordinary white Georgians.
White Georgians, yeah. And that wasn't how it went. And that caused such a political outcry that a lot of those legislators were voted out. Some of them, managed to hang on, but had to, change their political position about it and say, oh, that was terrible. We need to undo that. So the next legislative session, they undid it. So they passed a statute that repealed the Yazoo land grant and took back all the land from their friends that they had given it to. And then it was those friends who had received the land under the first statute and had to give it back under the second statute. They're the ones who sued. Right.
So that's what heads to the Supreme Court.
That went to the Supreme Court.
And it's difficult on so many levels, because on the one hand, you can understand the problem with having, well, what if you abuse the ability to constantly redo people's ownership of things, right? So right. You have that. But then at the same time, you also have this question of, but you can never undo fraud.
Right.
So that's what makes this case so, it's a difficult one, I think, a lot of times for early con law students to kind of grapple with, even setting aside all of the broader moral issues that we're bringing up, which is, oh, and yeah, by the way, where did this all come from?
Yeah. But I think you hit the nail on the head before, because I think to Marshall, the key thing here was stable property rights.
Right.
And he just didn't want state legislatures to be able to destabilize property rights. And so no matter how corrupt the land grant was, he didn't want to make a precedent where property rights could just simply be rescinded. And so he thought that was probably the more important part of the case.
And I think sometimes it can be difficult when you're trying to analyze things politically to understand the historic events that are occurring surrounding this. But you have to recall, one of the ways that I frame the Constitution, and we took slightly different views on this at the very beginning of the Constitution, but seeing the Constitution in part as a conservative kind of reaction to some of the more liberal elements of the revolution was, in the immediate wake of the revolution, you have a lot of things like Shays' Rebellion and similar kinds of items saying, hey, wait a second, right? We need to have some additional kinds of private property might need to give way to certain kinds of moral outcomes. And I read the contract clause in part as being a response to that. What do you think about, or at least the way it's interpreted by Marshall?
Yeah, I think that's right about Marshall's interpretation. I mean, I really don't think Hamilton thought through these issues. I think Hamilton was really concerned with banks, and these kind of issues don't necessarily involve banks. I think Hamilton's views were, we need a stable financial system, and some of these kind of questions are going to property rights and how strong they should be in ways that aren't going to have necessarily a direct impact on the financial system. But Marshall really wanted those property rights established and really didn't want states, being sort of forms of democracy that were seen as being closer and more responsive to the people. He thought there was just too much risk there, that the people would, undo property rights, and that would be ultimately a threat to liberty.
So again, Ken, obviously there's more than just the obligation to contracts. So that's a big part of this. What other elements of Article 1, Section 10 are worthy of some examinations as we finish up Article 1, you think?
Yeah. I could go on and on about the contracts clauses.
Well, I mean, we could do a couple episodes, right?
Yeah. But and I will just say before we leave it that
finish it with anything.
The 100 years of strong enforcement of the contracts clause that Marshall started get dialed back, particularly during the Great Depression, when the Roosevelt starts appointing justices to the court. And I think that I do want to just talk for a minute about the key case of Minnesota Mortgage Company versus Blaisdell, which is a 1935 case that's usually seen as kind of the end of that period of strong enforcement of the contracts clause. And
because you get Taney, you get Taney for a while, and then because let's see, who's the Chief Justice at that juncture when you get to that point? That is
by the time of 35, that chief would be Harlan Fiske Stone.
That's right. Okay, so talk to us about that interpretation.
Yeah, but you've got more starting to have Roosevelt appointees. So what happens is the Great Depression hits, and a ton of people are thrown out of work, and that's causing big problems in homeowners, stable middle class people who had jobs and had mortgages. A lot of them are suddenly not able to pay their mortgages, and I think in Minnesota, the legislature calculated that like 1/3 of all homeowners would be subject to foreclosure and becoming homeless because that many people had lost their jobs and now couldn't make their payments. And so Minnesota passed the mortgage moratorium law, and the mortgage moratorium law, state law, says, well, if you've got someone who's has been working, has a mortgage, and because of the Great Depression can't pay their mortgage. This is a lot like some of the kinds of things we saw during COVID, these temporary measures to get people through. The temporary measure that Minnesota came up with to get people through was they said, well, they can go into a state agency that was set up by this law and explain their circumstances. And then the state agency can give them a window of up to 2 years where they don't have to make the monthly payments for 2 years, and they can't be foreclosed upon. But all the money that they're not paying does get capitalized onto the loan. It doesn't get forgiven. So the concept here is, some people are going to get back on their feet within 2 years, and they're going to be able to start paying again, and they're going to have to pay, all the money they didn't pay and all the extra interest that accrued on that, but they're just getting this delay. Others, if 2 years go by and they're still not on their feet, they're going to be foreclosed on then. And so that was the concept of the Minnesota moratorium law. Now, the banks obviously didn't like it. They lent all this money, and now they're not able to collect any of it, and at least for the window of the moratorium. And so they challenged it. And I think under almost any understanding of the contracts clause from pre-1935, the banks would obviously have had a good claim. They entered into valid contracts. The contracts were lawful when they were entered into. They clearly stipulate, how many payments you can miss before you get foreclosed upon. And now the state is changing the law and giving people the right to not pay and still not get foreclosed upon. It's almost exactly the problem that Hamilton was predicting would happen.
Right.
And but the court sustains that law. They don't strike it down as unconstitutional. And the court in the Blaisdell case says, this isn't really extinguishing anybody's rights under the contract because, in the two possible situations that could happen under this law, either the debtor is going to get back on their feet and they're going to ultimately pay in full, including the extra interest for the delay. And so the bank will be made whole. There will just be a minor modification in the timeline, or the bank, is going to be able to foreclose. They're just going to be a minor modification about when they can foreclose. And the court in Blaisdell sort of says those kind of minor modifications that might come because of state law in response to some public necessity, those are not necessarily going to count as impairments. And so that really relaxes what had previously been much more stringent enforcement of the contracts clause. And that's more or less still the law we have now. So it's not as major of a constitutional area as it used to be.
It gets revitalized a little bit when you move into the Burger Court with cases like Trust versus New Jersey.
Yeah. Actually, if you give me the time, I'd love to talk about that case too.
Well, I mean, yeah, because that's. I mean, so you get a little bit because in the absolute most modern conception of the contract clause, right? You kind of have that two-step analytics, but that emerges again when you're replacing Warren and during the Burger Court. So yeah, talk a little bit about Trust for New Jersey because. Yeah. That really is kind of the beginning of what you would say is the actual most contemporary law and contract clause.
Yeah, I would say that it only makes a single exception to the general approach, which is still the Blaisdell approach. So I think the relaxed approach of Blaisdell is generally still the rule.
Yeah, you just kind of get modifications with Trust and with Spanus.
Yeah. In Trust, because the state itself is a party of the contract, which is different than in the Minnesota mortgage case. So the Minnesota mortgage case, the state wasn't a party to the contract. You had private homeowners and private mortgage lenders, and the state law was modifying that contract. But in the New Jersey Trust case, which involves the George Washington Bridge, which is my hometown bridge. I used to drive over that all the time to go between New Jersey and New York. So when the George Washington Bridge was built in the 50s, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, they sold a lot of bonds to pay to build that bridge, and it was a good bond to buy because everybody in the investment markets knew once they got that bridge up there, that is a license to print money. It was going to be the busiest bridge in the world. And the toll on it now, I think, is $16. And it wasn't always that high, but, you have zillions of cars going over it, paying $16 each. If you're investing to help build a bridge like that, you've got a pretty strong reason to believe that the money is going to get paid back. So it was a good investment. People the Port Authority did not need to offer very high interest rates because it was such a safe investment. Now, there was only one a bit of political risk that the bond markets were concerned about at the time. So even though everybody knew that the George Washington Bridge was going to be a massively good investment, there was this old subway system that ran between Jersey City, New Jersey, and Lower Manhattan. And it was called the Hudson Tubes. It was a little bit separate from the New York City subway system, and it was in terrible financial trouble. And because it ran between New York and New Jersey, and because the Port Authority, which was building the George Washington Bridge, is a bi-state agency of New York and New Jersey, a lot of bond investors were a little worried about that. They're like, oh, if the Port Authority becomes this cash cow with all this money, then everybody's going to look to them to take over the Hudson Tubes, which is a money-losing proposition. And so that could be a drag on the fiscal soundness of the Port Authority. So, Wall Street, which was buying a lot of the bonds and had some negotiating clout, Wall Street said to the Port Authority, look, if you want to sell us these bonds for the bridge, we're happy to buy them. But you've got to write it right into the text of the bonds that the money, the bonds are the investment, the money that's being invested in the bonds can only be used for the George Washington Bridge and for the highways that are going to connect to the George Washington Bridge, and cannot be used for any urban mass transit rail projects. And so the Port Authority did do that. They wrote that right into the bonds. And so Wall Street bought all these bonds. Now, what happened later, of course, was, the Port Authority took over the Hudson Tubes, and they diverted a lot of the toll money from the George Washington Bridge to subsidize the Hudson Tubes, which is exactly what they said that they wouldn't do.
Right.
But on the other hand, there was so much money that it never at all affected the fiscal soundness of the bonds. They made, they're supposed to pay a certain amount with interest every quarter, make all these quarterly payments. They always made all the payments. They were never late. They never missed any. They never were even close to, being in the red. They had tons of money. There was no problem. every investor got paid exactly as much as they were supposed to on every timeline they were supposed to. So some of the bondholders sued, and they said, well, the state has impaired the obligation of contracts here because they promised not to divert any of this money into urban mass transit. They wrote it right into the text of a contract that they signed, and then they breached it, and they diverted the money they said they wouldn't divert. Well, the Port Authority says, well, yeah, we did do that, but under the precedent of the Minnesota mortgage case that we talked about from the 30s, that's only a minor impairment because all the bondholders are getting the substantial benefits of the contract. The main thing a bondholder wants is to be paid the amount that they're supposed to be paid on the dates they're supposed to be paid, and they are getting that. And this is just a minor modification. It's not an impairment. Well, what the court says in the trust case is, well, it's true that that's just a minor modification and not an impairment, and that's the kind of thing we would have tolerated under the Missouri mortgage case. But we're not going to tolerate it here because it's one thing for the state to respond to public need by changing laws that affect private parties and make minor modifications of private contracts. But it's something different for a state to enter into a contract and then just decide that it's not going to honor its own obligations under the contract. And if it does that, we're going to apply a stricter standard. So they do go back to applying that little bit stricter standard in cases where the state is a contracting party and then tries to let itself out of its own obligations. But I would see that as just a particularized exception to the Blaisdell rule, which I would still see as the general rule.
So as we kind of finish up the show, what else might we want to kind of finish with here in Article 1, Section 10 to finish up Article 1?
Yeah, so the import-export stuff is interesting. States aren't allowed to put tariffs on imports or exports. And I think, one thing that's interesting about that, besides creating the internal free trade zone, is that there has been some interpretive debate over the years about whether that only applies to foreign imports and exports from foreign countries, or whether that also was meant to apply to tariffs just against other states. The Supreme Court has doctrine that doesn't let states do either,
right.
but it has actually broken it down so that it's only the foreign imports and exports that are said to be governed by Article 1, Section 10. And the ban on internal tariffs is said to be governed by a doctrine called the Dormant Commerce Clause that relates to the Commerce Clause that we talked about back when we talked about Section 8. That might be a little bit technical, but that's in there. And finally, states generally can't have troops. They are allowed to have National Guards, but that's subject to federal regulation and subject in time of need to being nationalized in and put under presidential control. And states there's a limited exception. They generally can't wage war, but they are allowed to wage war if they're attacked. And that has happened just a handful of times. The War of 1812 in particular, Canada came across and attacked New York. And New York did, respond as best it could militarily, and that is permitted. But other than that, there's a pretty strong prohibition against states waging war. That's something that generally has to be done by the United States Armed Forces.
And of course, that hasn't come up a lot, in large part because we've only ever had two powers on either side of the United States, one of which doesn't end up being a long-term power.
Yeah. Yeah, Mexico never attacked us. We attacked them a few times, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Just a little bit.
Yeah, Canada actually did. So we did have that one experience. And I grew up between Old Fort Niagara, which was the old fort from the War of 1812 on the American side, and Old Fort Erie, which was the British fort on the Canadian side. Yeah, because I'm from outside of Niagara Falls, New York originally. So that's where a lot of that fighting was done. And in fact, some say that the first counterattacks, this is sort of Buffalo mythology, but some say that the first counterattacks were, the group was called the Fenian Raiders. And the idea is that they were Irish Americans who were living in Buffalo drinking at the Fenian pub. And, being Irish, they just had this great hatred for Britain. And when they heard that the British had come across, they put together like a troop of kind of Buffalo drunken Irishmen from the pub, and they went in and attacked Canada. And that was one of the first counterattacks against Canada.
It's too stereotypical to even want to think it's true, but yet that could be true. Who knows? It's one of those things. It might not be, the Irish part, might be, but I can imagine that, your first responders in New York quite literally would have been like, we're going to get over there and we're going to shoot those Canadians. That part sounds right. Well, Ken, we were first kind of setting all this up. We had kind of wondered, are we going to have enough to get through? But, we've got a full show just on Article 1, Section 10. But what that means is that next time when we come back and we continue this conversation, we're going to start moving into the last two institutions of government. So just to be clear for listeners, right, we're going to get into Article 2, which is the presidency. We're going to get into maybe the least dangerous branch, or at least what some of the framers thought, in Article 3. And forewarning, we talked about this at the beginning, but they get shorter as you go along, in part because of kind of the views of the framers on the second two institutions of the federal government. And then we'll get to move forward from there. But for now, that's the end of this supporter show. So I just want to thank you. If you're listening, you've come to this point, that means you're a supporter of the show. I hope that you really have enjoyed going through the Constitution. If you're on Discord or other places, please feel free to reach out and let us know what you think about what Ken and I have been doing. Otherwise, we're going to continue marching through the Constitution for however long it takes. I don't know about you, Ken. I told some of I'm teaching constitutional law. I don't get to teach that all the time. I was teaching constitutional law this semester, and I was talking about how we were going in all this depth for listeners. And a number of my students their generalized feeling was one semester was enough. Why would anybody want to do that? Yeah. So I hope that you've been really enjoying this. I enjoyed doing it. But again, now, I don't know what your level is, so you may still want to take a look at the show notes. Head to patreon.com/politicsguys to find out what we've got going on. I also apologize if you can hear in the background any of my students who are talking really loudly right now because it's the end of the semester. But you can head to patreon.com/politicsguys to kind of see where you are. We have all different kinds of levels of support that you can have and do. Again, please head that. I thank you so much for being a part of this. If you've got any kind of question or comment and gripe, you already know how to get a hold of us, but I hope you do. Mail at politicsguys.com, Facebook, Twitter, or again, if you're a supporter, on Discord, where I've been talking with a bunch of you recently. Thank you so much. The executive producers of The Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, and Ivan English. Thank you all, and I hope you'll be back with us a new episode this weekend. Hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.